Ready to start. So, all right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from NVKBA. We'd like to welcome everyone to our first, we'll call it kind of a podcast. We don't have fancy microphones or anything like that. But with us tonight, we got Mr. John Odenkirk. Thank you for joining us tonight. I certainly appreciate it. We appreciate it very much so. I know we're so close because of the camera. I feel like I should be doing this instead. So tonight, we're going to be talking about black bass, the spawn time. But I also want to be able to focus on conservation of black bass, as I know we all know it's an important topic. As we start to roll into some of the questions that we've already talked about, laid out, I know a lot of people in the audience, a lot of members are going to have questions as well. I want to be able to at least kind of cover a couple things around the spawn and conservation. But before we do that, tell us about yourself. What do you do? Who are you? You know what I mean?
I'm living the dream, man.
It sounds like you are. I would love to have you.
Yeah, I'm a local boy from Northern Virginia. Went to Virginia Tech, got a bachelor's in fisheries, worked for the Game Commission, and we've changed names 3 times. And then I went to graduate school in Tennessee, got a master's in fisheries. Then I went to Florida, worked for the feds for a while, worked with sturgeon and stripers. And my wife hated Panama City Beach, which is where I was stationed, like newlyweds. And if I hadn't moved, we probably wouldn't be married, but we're still married. We left Panama City Beach to NVKBA.
Right.
And we came back to both of our homes, Northern Virginia, where I got a job working for the Department of Game and Fisheries, second name change. And I essentially worked in the district where I grew up, which was pretty neat.
I mean, that's pretty fortunate for you to be able to do it, because now not only is it going to be something that you're familiar with, you know all the good fishing spots, you know all the great fishing spots, especially now. You have people that can use out to connect with and make new connections in addition to your job, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been phenomenal.
If you had to choose right now,
You have to speak up.
say again?
You have to speak up higher, or like move closer.
Okay.
No, by all means.
Just a mic.
We can talk
As
loud.
loud as we need to talk. So, how about now? I hope this is good. Give us feedback in the audience before we go and bring you in live. To ask your questions. We're good. Okay. Please post anything you need. So behind the screen is John McKelvin, one of our members. He's going to be helping to provide as much feedback as possible as far as the IT side of the house and help keep things moving as we need to. So should I think I know like this? Is this okay?
I'm just trying to be almost half as big as you are.
I'll keep it down like this. Like that. Lower my seat as much
There
as
you
I
go.
can.
Yeah,
Right?
get down on the ground.
So, bass or snakehead? What's your favorite?
I'm gonna get in trouble. I can't answer that. I'm gonna plead pretty good, man.
I figured it would be.
No, I love them. I don't like them both, but I like to catch them both. How's that? I'm trying to be diplomatic.
I mean, so it's not going to be comparable, right? 5-pound bass versus a 5-pound snakehead.
They're different constituencies in terms of anglers. A lot of people that fish, well, it's changing. It used to be the only people that fish for northern snakeheads were people who wanted to eat them. But they've got more of a sport fish following now.
Absolutely, right?
But there's still a lot of people that catch them to eat them for good reason.
They're delicious, absolutely delicious. So do you foresee, not to get off topic of bass, but do you see them becoming a sport fishing junction in Northern Virginia?
Eventually, I think they will be. There's almost no question that at some point, because if you look at what they've done in places like Florida or Hawaii or even Japan, over time, the numbers don't sustain. And we've already seen that starting to happen here. Places where they've been the longest, the numbers are declining. And that's due to exploitation and assimilation. So the numbers, they just can't, that population can't withstand the pressures that the environment and the angler groups place on them. And so the numbers decline. And at some point, like bass, which are not native here, right? It took 150 years for largemouth and smallmouth to sort of reach the lovable,
Wow, really?
kind of, you know, near and dear to our heart, right? Most of these fish were not native to Virginia. They were stocked in the late 1800s. So I think snakeheads will probably get there a lot faster, but at some point, probably while I'm still alive, I don't think I'll be a biologist with DWR, but I'll still be alive when game fish status or sport fish status will be probably placed on snakeheads, unless I die.
I hope so. I
Premature.
do. I hope so. Because I got to say, the ones that I've caught, they give me a hell of a fight, and they are delicious. They really are. They're going to be.
They
I
are.
gotta say. Now, what do they do for the bass numbers? I understand that the latest stats that I read, and I know you're the expert, bass outnumber them 3-1, right?
Well,
Or
no, that's
thereabout.
generally it's bass are more than that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, see, a lot of the numbers you cite or that get thrown around a lot are relative abundance numbers. They're not absolute. In other words, it's not a population estimate. It's numbers such as, in our terms, the number of fish per hour of electrofishing time that we catch. And so that's a relative measure of how many fish are out there. And to give you an example, last year in most of the creeks around Mount Vernon, which is where snakeheads have been the longest, which is now about 20 years, typically those catch rates were for snakeheads, if you average them out through the year, they were 3 to 7 fish per hour. The Quiet Creek in Stafford County has always been higher. It's a more productive creek. It was colonized later. And so that creek typically is going to be around 20 snakeheads per hour, quite a bit higher than the we're called four creeks around Mount Vernon. But bass numbers typically are around 100 fish an hour in most of those creeks. So
100 fish an hour, right?
that's you move the decimal point, okay? That's an order of magnitude more bass in most relative abundance metric estimates than snakeheads.
So we're talking 4 or 5 to 1 at a minimum.
No, minimum, yeah. So there's no question. If snakeheads ever got as abundant as bass, then we might be having a different discussion right now. But so far they haven't, and there's no sign that they will. So what that tells me is that, okay, when you look at a system like the Potomac, it's a fish factory, and you have an organism at a trophic level, such as the largemouth bass, which is basically the top, and that food web, food chain, it's at the top with long-nosed garb, with bowfin, which are in the Rappahannock, there's not many in the Potomac, but all those fish are at the same trophic level. And you throw the snakehead in, okay? The variability in bass numbers from year to year, maybe you get 80 one year, 100 per hour another year, 90, 70, 150 in some cases. It bounces all around between 80 and 120 per hour usually. When you take another 5 to 10 snakeheads an hour and throw that into the mix, it's insignificant. It doesn't matter in the scheme of things. Now, if you were having, if snakehead catch rate was 100 an hour, then we'd be talking about competition. Because for competition to occur, there has to be a limitation on the food resource, the forage base, whether it's gizzard shad or white perch or bluegill or whatever it is. But I argue that it hasn't happened yet because there's no limitation.
Yeah, and that actually kind of brings up a good point as a segue also for the bass to talk about larger numbers and why, as a term you said to me before, selective harvesting, why that's going to be so important is it plays a huge role for not harvesting the larger bass as opposed to the smaller bass stuff. It is not a limitation on the food source, correct?
Well,
we'll come back to that.
Yeah, so when you start talking about harvesting black bass, in tidal rivers and large reservoirs, it's a non-starter. Nobody's keeping bass, and I say nobody, 99.9% of the people that fish Lake Anna, the Potomac River, the tidal Rappahannock, they're not keeping bass. You go underneath the bridges on Route 1, there's some sustenance fishermen there that might keep a bass or two. That is meaningless at the population level. Now, if you go to some of our small impoundments, like Lake Orange or Mott's Reservoir, Spotsylvania, places like that, we might see 15, 18% harvest rate on black bass. That's still not enough to affect the population. But there is some consumption angling occurring on those resources. But we've done creel surveys on the Potomac River on the tidal section. We've done creel surveys on Lake Anna where we interview anglers. We know that 99.7% of bass being caught are released voluntarily. So we start talking about size restrictions.
It doesn't really play a role anyway. So.
Zero role. The whole idea behind a size restriction is the fisheries manager wants you as an angler to help us restructure the fish population based on selective harvest. If nobody's harvesting fish, there's no need for any regulation.
So if we were to say this, kind of back up, and let's say that we had 20% population all around that were harvesting bass. And I'm going to go back to some very important words that were actually by Dave Steger, excuse me. And that was, he had pointed out Glenn Lau. Glenn Lau, famous, he was a very famous underwater cinematographer who made a documentary, I think it was all the way back to the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, talking about how, I don't talk loud, this is why we need microphones, IT, huh? This is why we need microphones. So, but it goes back to, when you do the catch and release, or when you do your harvesting of the bass at larger numbers, it's really going to take out those big bass, those double digits that everyone was looking for, their personal best. But like I said, I want to circle back to that. Let me go back to what we had for our rhythm here, and let me ask a few more questions of you. The personal question. Sure. Did you fish as a kid?
Absolutely. Caught my first fish was a creek chub, And Bryan Branch, which is a tributary to Pemmon Run in Fairfax County, probably caught that fish when I was 5-ish.
Okay, it's pretty young, but still good though. Good memories, aren't they? I have those in my father from a pond near where I grew up.
Right.
And so what was your personal best as a kid, or even now today, what's your personal best? You can't say something like 4 pounds doing what you do. Don't say that. It's got to be double.
Freshwater or saltwater?
Freshwater bass.
Oh, all right, largemouth bass. All right, I'm sorry. Honestly, I don't think I've ever caught a citation bass. That being by weight, 8 pounds. I don't think I've ever caught an 8-pound bass. I've caught citation smallmouth bass, but I don't think I've ever caught a citation largemouth.
That's okay. That's okay. Neither have I. So it makes 2 of us. You know what? And cheers to that. Oh, she took it. It's okay.
She told me to tell you to stop drinking.
No, it's okay. She
Front of the camera.
So, are you the only family that's going to work?
Yes.
How did you fall into that? Just a love that grew from childhood.
An aptitude test in high school told me to look at the forestry curriculum in college, which I did. And as I was ready to transition at Virginia Tech into my junior year, when you start to take classes that really impact your major, I realized that forestry wasn't what I wanted. But I had no idea you could have a career in fisheries. And they gave, back then you had 35mm slides, and they gave you different orientation presentations about the options that were available in the School of Natural Resources. Well, after I got through all the wildlife and interpretive and forestry, and then fisheries came up. And I was like, wow, you can have a career doing that.
Are you kidding me right now?
So I said, I'm living the dream.
Sure.
And I never looked back.
If I could do electrofishing for the rest of my life, I don't care how cold it is. Having been in all the parts of the world I have, and as cold as it gets, Korea of all places, I would do it in a heartbeat. I would go. I would do what you do. You definitely are living the dream. So let's go to some of the questions that we were talking about. So, and we kind of already touched on this, black bass populations in Northern Virginia. Right now, as far as an overview, we've already touched on a lot of it actually. If there's something that you could tell us right now pertaining to the spawn time, are we in pre-spawn?
We're absolutely in pre-spawn right now.
Is it based on water temperature?
It's water temperature is probably the third most important variable in timing of spawn. I think the first most important variable is probably photo period, which is day length.
Okay.
Fish are going to cue to day length more than anything, and then they're going to respond to some other environmental conditions like flow, if they're in a reservoir, water level, and then a river. You know, the amount of flow that's occurring based on obviously precipitation events, and then also moon phase can play a role when the fish are getting close. A lot of times, you know, they'll spawn full moon.
Is it really? So it's not a moon?
No, absolutely not.
You know,
A lot of things are weird.
you have so many anglers in NVKBA and I mean all over the world, worldwide, where they pull up their smart app, and I'm not alone. I know John does as well. They'll pull up their smartphone, open the app, and be like, no, that's not going to work for me. There's not enough fish showing on there. It is like watching, like on a scale of
It's the solar lunar table.
Yeah, that's the solar lunar table. So it's like, are they going to be doing it because of the new moon? Is it, you know, what's the moon going to be tomorrow? Are we going to be able to push that? Why does that affect us? Do we know?
I can't honestly explain all that hocus pocus. I'm not a big BSer. If I don't know the answer, I'm just gonna say I don't really know the answer. But it works. I mean, I hunt and I fish, and there's obviously a lot of other factors that play a role in animal behavior, but there's a lot tied into that solar lunar movement and feeding pattern. I know a famous striped bass guide at Lake Anna, whose initials are JH. He relies on that very, very heavily for plotting his outings.
I can't blame him. We have guys that do it as well. I mean, do you use it as well? If you?
Oh, I use it, sure. If I'm trying to find,
I use it. I do. There's like literally 4 apps I check, and if I'm not on one of them at least daily, trying to plot out my week,
I just look at one
I'm
app.
screwing up. I know I am.
I look at one app, well, technically 2 parts, the solar and the lunar, and I put them together myself. So that's the only time that I like to really go out.
Yeah. And so with spawn time right now, if you know where you said we're in pre-spawn, and that's based on the different railroads that you're giving us. What about the spawn? When does that actually hit? So
you can't just say spawn is now. I mean, because the whole thing is protracted. It's a progression, and the progression is variable based on the water body. And so in a very small pond, you know, it gets warmed very quickly. You know, maybe some bass are already getting ready to bed. It's very possible, but it's not going to be the same, and every water is different for everything. So people always want to generalize, but you really can't generalize. You know, to me, the peak. So in college, one of the exam questions was, you know, when does smallmouth spawn, when do largemouth spawn? What's the trigger temperature? And so, you know, you never forget 62 for smallmouth, 68 for largemouth. Those are just drilled into your head. So again, if the photo period is correlated probably with water temperature, right? You know, it's going to be highs and lows. You know, this time of year, if the water's stained, you can have 10-degree fluctuation in water temperature in a day, you know, from dawn till dusk. And that's why I tell a lot of people, you know, this time of year, even me personally, if I'm going to go fishing, I'll generally choose an afternoon rather than a morning, because the fish are going to be a lot more active if the water temperature is 8 degrees warmer than it is, you know, at dawn when it's, you know, it's been 32 degrees that night. So those fish are going to come out of, you know, off of the channels, and they're going to be close to the drops, and they come up in the fords, especially on the southern exposure, you know, to feed where it's a little warmer on the shelf. But you know, so Lake Anna, you have thermal effluent changing the water temperature and circulation patterns there. You've got you've got the different things in the tidal rivers. So you can't just say now's the spawn, because even in the population, not all fish are spawning at the same time. So you have a protracted spawning generally in any population. Largemouth generally spawn once a year, but just because they start spawning, you know, in another week, they could still be spawning in easily second week of May.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. So you said generally once a year.
Right, from most.
So my understanding is that you'll have, you know, based on the size, blackouts are going to spawn at different levels at different times.
Right.
So bigger ones first, small ones later.
Generally, yeah. I mean, I've never seen anything in the peer-reviewed literature that asserts that is in fact the case, but it's sort of like the full moon thing. I think it's yes. I think in many cases, the larger and more dominant females will spawn earlier than younger ones.
And then what about, you said it was generally once a year, is there more than once a year this spawn?
In certain scenarios where there's, say in a tidal river, if you were on the early end of the spawn and you had, you know, a major storm, dump a couple inches of rain, and there was a huge blowout, and sort of the fish kind of sense that, and sort of as an adaptation to try to make up for that. In a lot of scenarios, there could be an effort to respawn in a year. So yeah, what we call in fisheries vernacular, we call it a bimodal young of year length distribution. So a lot of times if we're sampling in the fall, we'll see the young fish, which we call YOYs for young of the year, or age zeros, meaning they were spawned that year. We'll see two peaks. You know, you might see a bunch of fish that are about this big, and you see a bunch of fish that are about that big. And that's fairly typical in a lot of different situations where you have, you know, two kind of distinct spawning pulses. Even though largemouth bass spawn once a year, you can still see that, you know, which is different from snakeheads, which are spawning distinctly two different times, you know, once in early June and once in mid-August probably, and you see those two very dramatic peaks in those populations.
So as we have a spawn right now, and the fish are starting to move in, the bass are moving into the shallows, and the temperatures are going to be able to kind of help dictate that as we start to get closer to the May, June timeframe. So now you're actually going to have a lot of different competitions going on within the fish themselves, trying to eat each other's young. You're going to have bass are going to be impacted by not only bluegill, but also snakehead.
Well, sure, and there's always nest predators, either bluegill and white perch. There's a whole host of fish that scavenge nests. Even insectivores like bluegill are going to eat fry, bass, and snakeheads and everything else. But what people need to understand, and this is a key point, especially for a lot of you sitting at home and thinking about some of these, we call it population dynamics, and what's really driving these different fish populations. And this also comes into the discussion of bed fishing. So you can't bed fish because you're gonna spoil that fish's
That's the question we have,
right? In my mind, that's complete BS. Don't worry about it. If you want to bed fish, bed fish. If that's an ethical thing, then you have to deal with that. But there's no biological reason not to bed fish in my mind, because what happens is your class strength. That means the success of the spawn is governed by factors that are environmentally related, not human fisherman, angler related or harvest related. So if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. So good year classes are going to be set based on good environmental conditions. And what that usually means for us, if we're talking about river fisheries, that means we have normal flows during the spring. We don't have blowouts, we don't have droughts. That gives us good year classes. And that usually also means, consistent with that is usually favorable conditions for aquatic vegetation. In tidal rivers like the Potomac and the Rappahannock, tidal aquatic vegetation is so important for nursery areas and nesting and success of recruitment. And typically when we have poor recruitment, we have high flows, and that also hurts aquatic vegetation. Sometimes not just that year, but sometimes the following year. So we'll get these holes in the population where we say we won't have any or very few age 0 fish this year, and almost no age 1 fish, you know, down the line, because they weren't there, they were never made. But that's fine as long as it's just 1 year. But when you get 2 years, or especially 3 years, in the case of the Rappahannock, we had around the year 1998 through 2003, we had a series of droughts and tropical storms that resulted out of 6 years, we had 5 blowouts. And we had people screaming bloody murder.
Is that bad?
Yeah, and that's when we were actually forced to stock fish. Mother Nature gave us some really good year classes following that, but the tournament anglers down at that time, I still remember one of the guys, we were giving a presentation to all the tournament anglers in the boardroom in Richmond at our headquarters. And one of the guys flashed up some very impressive data. And one of the guys said, "I don't want your damn data, stock fish now."
You're going to get the guys who are hardcore. You really are.
Yeah. And I understand where they're coming from, but if they waited, Mother Nature would have brought that fishery
Bring the
back.
balance back, yeah.
But you know what? We stocked fish anyway, and it came back even better, I guess.
So that kind of goes back to the whole heart of everything we were saying. Well, let me back up real quick. So one of the biggest questions that I have is for conservation, is it relates to what you're talking about. As an angler, when we go out there and we do our tournaments, I'm talking about from the time I pick the water to the time I have a fish on my board, my catch board, right? You know, how long, what's going to be, from my research, what's a good time to have the fish out of the water before, as I'm taking photographs, trying to line everything up correctly, before I put them in the water on the dunker leash to make sure, you know, they don't swim off before I get a good photo and verify. You know, what is it, I'm talking overall, that we can as anglers do to help not only contribute to preservation, but also conservation for the future generations that we have. If you had to pick, say, 2 things, maybe 3.
Well, I mean, that you're doing as anglers to help conserve the population.
Absolutely, yeah. So harvesting is obviously one of them.
No, people are already doing it. I mean, angler care of black bass is now better than it's ever been. Ever. And that's due to constant education and improvements in technology and understanding and information flow.
Social media.
Yeah, everything. And no, even in my career, when I started, the catch and release ethic was beginning, but it hadn't really become blossomed to the point that it is now. We've got people that just would never even consider killing a bass voluntarily. I mean, it's just beyond their comprehension why anybody would do it. And in some cases, you know, we ask people to harvest smaller bass. You know, that's where this whole thing of selective harvest comes in. Typically not in tidal rivers, and not even in larger reservoirs like Lake Anna or Smith Mountain, but a lot of times in small lakes, Burke Lake or Lake Riddle, you know, Curtis, we get stockpile of bass populations. Typically it's a largemouth bass. Typically it's going to be fished at 9 to 13 inches. Some lakes, especially private lakes that don't have any harvest, like Lake of the Woods or Fawn Lake, you see the same stockpile, but it moves up the size chart a little bit, where you have a huge stockpile of like 14 to 17 inch bass. Yeah. And you know, people go out all day long and you can catch 50, 17 inch bass. And some people think that's fantastic. Of course, the people that live there want to catch, you know, a 6 or 8 pounder. And they're like, well, you know, how can I get a 6 or 8 pounder? Well, you got to thin out all those 17 inch bass. And the ones that are left can finally start growing a little bit and get into the bigger size categories with a whole new option of prey size will be available to them as that gape increases.
Yeah, I guess that's, and not to interrupt, but just to kind of jump on that. So if we have a bass that is 19, 20 inches long already, it can be able to disable even 13 inch bass, right? That's kind of what you're getting at. it's the size of the mouse, so you can start to pick on different levels of food in that tree. You gotta go bigger and bigger and bigger, because from the time it's born, it has a 50% chance of even making it to that size, but also with good genetics, and that people only. And then also given the fact that if it does have the genetics, it has to overcome all those obstacles now to get to even to the point where it can make it to at least a 5-6 pound bass. But it has a chance once it's done that. And now as it's starting to grow larger and larger, and by the means, I'm not trying to say what I think, because I'm not, but as a angler and I do my research, I know that when I'm looking for two types. I'm either looking for the road bass on the bank, or I'm going out and trying to get those schooling bass. So in a lot of ways, bass are kind of like people, introverts and extroverts. You got road bass that are on the bank, and that's what I like to target.
Right.
And it's funny, you have people who are in kayaks fishing towards the shore. You know, people on the shore who are fishing, you know, throwing out but bringing it back in. It's always the bank line, and that's where I've caught some of my biggest bass in 2-3 foot of water.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I guess that kind of plays back to, if we have our bass that are schooling out there, are they going to be schooling in similar sizes?
Generally, yes.
Is that because of competition?
I don't know if it's competition or it's just what they've done. You know, since they were recruited, they stayed together. And typically it's smaller bass. I don't typically ever see a lot of larger bass schooling behavior. But typically it's younger bass.
What's the biggest bass you've ever handled when you've done electro fishing?
Maybe 10 and a quarter. I mean, we don't see, and again, I don't work, you know, Briary creates some of the bigger, more trophy waters in Virginia. They get a few bigger fish, but people don't realize how scarce an 8 pound or a 9 pound or a 10 pound plus bass really is. There's not that many out there, which is why we're trying to change it a little bit with some of this F1 stuff.
Good segue. So when you talk about let's talk about the F1 bass in just a second, right? But does the water have to have a minimum depth for the bass to spawn? No,
not really. It depends on where you are. Every system's different. The transparency of the water generally is going to have a lot to do with how deep a bass will bed. Water that's very, very clear, the fish is probably going to bed a little deeper than very turbid water. Tidal rivers, of course, where you have tidal deltas every day, 2 feet. Typically in the Potomac, you know, your water, you're at low tide, your bass nest could be a foot or 2 of water. At high tide, it's going to be, 4 or 5 feet of water. It knows, and that's very turbid. Tidal rivers are generally very turbid. Lake Anna, you're probably going to have a lot of nests in 7, 8, 9 feet of water.
Really?
Well, Lake Anna is a trophic gradient, meaning as you go down lake, not only is turbidity decreased, nutrients are decreased, everything's decreased. So you go from water that looks like Potomac River water up at 522, at the top of Lake Anna, but it takes a year for the water to get all the way down here by the dam. And then it's like the still water, jet clear. And you can see 15 feet down. So bass nesting behavior up here is not going to be the same as that.
You can see that. Right? It's funny because I get up at Potomac and I always have that sludge residue.
Yeah, right. Well, you're not going to get that and put it in Lake Anna on the dam.
So, do you have any questions, Poston?
So we got one.
By all means, who we got?
We got 2.
First
one that says.
Who is it, first of all?
Is Mike Ortega?
Yeah. Mike runs the show. Please bring him on. So that way we can see him on screen and he can ask his question.
Let's see if he can ask.
Hey, what's up, guys? You got me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Mike. Can't see it, but I can hear you.
Hey, first and foremost, John, we appreciate you very much, brother. This is awesome. This is and Jim as well, man, for setting this whole thing up. Super excited about this. It's really cool. Definitely, I didn't catch the beginning, but I definitely look forward to looking at the whole thing here. I don't know how long I can stay on, but I did have one question for John, and it's something maybe I don't know if it's just due to my short time that I've been in Virginia thus far. I moved here in 2016. Obviously, the Army brought me here, like military. DoD brings a lot of folks, especially to the Northern Virginia area. And the first place I hit was the Potomac River, right? And I really noticed when I got here, I had never had a flipping stick in my arsenal until I got to the Potomac River. So needless to say, tons of grass when I got here. I was fishing more specifically Pohick Bay out on Fort Belvoir, Gunston Bay area, all the way up at Atkinson Creek. One thing I noticed over the last couple of years, and maybe it's just me, maybe I haven't spent enough time on the Potomac because been trying to become a little more diverse in my skill. I've been spreading out to lakes and things like that. But one thing I think I've noticed kind of a trend of maybe a little bit less grass over the years. I don't know if that's due to rain. I don't know if that's due to, I'm just trying to figure out maybe what that's due to. I've noticed less grass. I've also noticed sort of a change in tide levels overall. It feels like the, high tide isn't as high as it used to be. So I was just kind of curious, John, of what your thoughts are on that. If you've seen anything, to indicate lower tide levels overall within the past couple of years, or if I'm just, maybe not looking in the right areas.
Okay, hey, didn't I meet you at Quiet Creek right below Quiet Harbor? Was it last spring or 2 springs ago in a kayak?
You may have. I've been there quite a bit over the last couple of years.
Okay, I'm pretty sure we met. I got a picture.
I know. I'm pretty sure we met at least once before.
All right, thanks for that question. So,
Yes, sir.
two very distinct things. One about tides and one about grass. And honestly, I don't think tides have changed. They still seem like we get some really low lows and some really high highs, and of course a lot of that's related to moon phase and off tropical depressions that might be off the coast drive a lot of that. So I can't imagine that that's changed, although I guess anything's possible in science. I've learned to say that didn't happen. But I don't know. So I'm not going to bullshit you on that. I just don't know. I don't think it's happened, but I don't know. In terms of the grass, that's a huge component. And as we've already alluded to a little bit, grass drives so much. I'm not going to say everything, but it drives so much of what happens with largemouth and everything else on the tidal systems, freshwater, especially tidal systems like the Potomac and the Rappahannock. And grass abundance has been dramatically fluctuating in recent years. Okay, 2018 was the wettest year in history. So we took a hit on grass in 2018. Before that, times were really good. The last real hit we took, I think, was Tropical Storm Lee and Irene in 2011 and maybe 2012, and the grass beds didn't recover probably until about 2013. But we were living high on the hog for 13 through 17. Grass was going up. We had great year classes of largemouth bass, and everything was fantastic. And then 2018 came along, and we took a bit of a hit. That said, it seems to me, being on the water last year, that the grass in most creeks was back to normal levels. I say pre-2018 levels, but there's other things going on too. And if you really want to study up on a lot of this grass stuff, there's a USGS professor, or she's not a professor, she's retired. Her name's Nancy Rybicki. Last name is Rybicki, Nancy Rybicki. And she's published a number of papers on aquatic vegetation in the tidal Potomac. She was one of the ones that also, sort of as tangent, that hypothesized that hydrilla was sort of a very beneficial thing to happen to the tidal Potomac, because at the time that hydrilla was accidentally, inadvertently released in the 80s, I believe it was the early 80s, but I'm not positive, it sort of jump-started the productivity and the habitat that was lacking, had been lacking through the 60s and 70s and most of the 80s in the tidal Potomac. And hydrilla could colonize areas that our native vegetation couldn't. But what hydrilla did was clean the water enough and create suitable habitat that allowed the return of native vegetation like Vallisneria and a lot of other stuff that's in there now. So you can go to say Pohick Bay, and you can see a lot of hydrilla, but you also see a lot of Vallisneria, and you see a lot of pondweed, and a lot of, you go to certain creeks, Quantico Creek, you see a lot of milfoil. So depending on where you go, what creeks you're in, you can see tremendous quantities of submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV for short, which, as I said, is so important for recruitment of bass and other fish, and plays a role in survival of those year classes. Some creeks, Doe Creek's a good example. Little Honey Creek is another one. There's almost no grass now, and I can't explain why those creeks haven't recovered. 10 years ago, those creeks were loaded. Doe Creek was full of milfoil for years, and there's almost nothing in that creek for probably a decade. Same with Little Honey. And I suspect it probably has something to do with, once the vegetation is hit so hard, it's punched so many times, it just can't get back up off the mat. When you take the impervious watershed that a lot of these systems have, it's 30 to 40%, and you're just constantly dumping in the runoff, the turbid runoff, you just don't have sunlight penetration, and you don't have the establishment of the colonies that get the grass bed started again. That's probably plays a role in it, but Nancy postulated there's a number of things going on in the substrate that has to do with like nutrient depletion, propagule transport, which is like the seeds of hydrilla, the tubers, the turions that are able to start new colonies as they get dispersed by the currents or waterfall or whatever. So there's a lot of stuff going on with SAV, and it's important stuff, and it's sort of a sidelight to the whole fisheries evaluations and fisheries management. But they're connected, and obviously you can't have a good one without the other. And so we try to keep up. DC's done a really good job of monitoring their SAV, and their annual report DC puts out, they quantify the type, the species, and the amount, because they have a pretty small piece of Potomac, so they can really concentrate on that little piece of Potomac, and they do a good job of quantifying the fish and the vegetative part of the habitat inside the DC waters. And Danny Ryder, one of the folks up at DC, I'm sure would be happy to share some of that information with you. We don't, in Virginia, we don't even try to quantify our SAV beds. We just don't have the time and the personnel, or, and to do it. But when I use DC as a surrogate for, like if I want to model recruitment or something, in terms of how much SAV we've had, I go to their data. So I guess I'm kind of rambling here, but it's a good question. It's very, very important.
Or reinvent the wheel, we don't have to.
Right.
Yeah. We have Priscilla's question. Priscilla, are you still on? Is she still on? Or did she post her question?
She's on.
She's on. All right, let's go ahead if you don't mind.
So she didn't repost it, but she said,
is she able to be run on so she can ask them directly?
let's see.
Thought I'd be able to stay off here. Hi, John. Quick question. How long do the parents stay with the young of the snakehead?
Well, with everything in science, it's variable. Normally, I'm going to say for 3 or 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks. If they don't get caught, longer, possibly even for 2 months. So it could be for quite a while. We've seen some pretty big snakeheads with still, in terms of young year fish, I'm talking maybe 3 inches, still with one guard on those fish. So I think a lot of it depends on the continuity of the brood and the parents. And as long as those parents are not, removed, they will stay a long time, which obviously increases the chance of the young survival.
What happens if one of the parents is caught away from that?
Then the other parent.
I mean, any idea?
Generally, the other parent will maintain a guard over the brood until that parent is gone.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, great question. I didn't know that. I had no idea.
And that's not a hard and fast rule, but like in science, nothing's hard and fast. But
All right. Hey, is Dave on? Dave Steger? Dave?
I'm on, but I can't hear you. I can't hear anything.
I'm not hearing anything either.
Can you hear us now?
Yep.
Okay, Dave, if you don't mind, can you go ahead and ask your questions? You had quite a few, and I have them up too.
Yeah, I had 6 or 7 of them. Off the top of my head, I was curious, what's your professional opinion on gut hooked bass? You see a lot of things about, some people say leave the hook in them. There's a technique of going through the gill and twisting the hook up and getting it out pretty carefully. Some people say cut the hook and just leave the barb and the bend in it. What's best for the bass?
that's best up to your professional judgment. I've done all of the above before. Generally, we tell people just go ahead and cut the line. But if you look down, it depends how long you played the fish, and all gut hooks are not the same. And if you're looking down that, and most of us have gut hooked enough bass that we know if if there's a reasonable chance that you can get that hook out without causing a whole lot more stress to the fish. I've done both ways, and honestly, I don't know that there's been a tagging study done to statistically confirm one method over the other. But I think either method could result in a fairly high survivability of the fish. But it depends on a lot of factors. And so I leave that up to your professional judgment. I would say either cutting the line at the fish's mouth, or if it looks like you can probably get it out fairly easily, I'd go that route, sometimes too. So there's not a hard and fast rule from a biological standpoint.
All right, I appreciate that. On a completely different subject, I was looking at the DWR website for Occoquan Reservoir, and it said it's managed for bass and crappie and catfish. And just wondering, what does that mean? Is it stocked? Is the aquatic vegetation managed in any way, or what do you do to manage it?
That sounds like Steve Owen's quote. So one of the biologists who used to work with me, he would, yeah. Essentially, that just means those are the common recreational fishes that you would find in that water body. We're not managing it. It's under management because we're surveying it and stocking it as it's needed. But the fish that you meant, well, okay, not all the fish that you mentioned, largemouth bass, bluegill, black and white crappie, and channel cat. Well, actually, everything on there except northern pike are self-sustaining populations. The northern pike were stocked at one time, but they haven't been stocked in Occoquan for years. So that is inaccurate, and we should edit that website post, that narrative, because we're not managing Occoquan for northern pike, and there's no northern pike in Occoquan. There's some chain pickerel, but there's no northern pike.
Are they related?
Yeah, they're sausage. They're in the same family, and chain pickerel are native to Virginia. Northern pike are not. We stock northern pike very limited in some waters for sort of a trophy diversification potential, but they're so expensive to raise and to stock that now we've really scaled our sausage production back because it's hard to justify based on the number of anglers that are actually trying to catch one of them. So we don't stock them in Occoquan anymore. But so yeah, management just means they're there. We're managing the lake, so it's sort of I wouldn't have phrased it that way, but I can see why you asked that question. But yeah, so sorry, just keep going down this list.
Yeah, but I mean, well, that's good. Maybe he wants to.
So Dave, did that answer that one?
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you.
But Dave, you have a few other questions on here too. Do you want me to read from your slide or the questions you posted, or do you just want to keep going? Do you have your own list?
No, I don't have a list in front of me. I know I asked about the state-owned lakes, the Brittle and
Yep.
Burke, and there's quite a few others, and just wondering what the difference and why the state manages those different.
Very important, because those lakes, the state-owned public fishing lakes, those are lakes that we own. DWR, we own those lakes. Their only purpose for being is recreational fishing. Brittle, the only four in my work area are Brittle, Burke, Orange, and Curtis. They're 365 days a year, 24/7. You can fish on those lakes, free. There's no charge for anything. You launch a boat, you can fish from the bank. The concessions are there if they're open, but you can go there anytime. The only purpose of those lakes being is fishing. We bought them and built them and manage them with your licensed dollars. All the other lakes in Virginia are owned by some other entity besides us, and fishing is not the primary use. Fishing is a secondary or tertiary use. So that means that it gets put, we're down the flagpole in terms of priority. Lake Anna is obviously nuclear power generation. Moss Reservoir's water supply. Most reservoirs are water supply, like Occoquan, which, by the way, has the best largemouth bass population of any lake I've ever seen in my life. Sorry, I won't say that anymore.
What's going on here? No, please go ahead.
So anyway, that's the difference. That's why Burke and Brittle and the state-owned lakes are special, and that's what separates them from all other lakes.
Dave's caught quite a few out there, and it's funny how, Dave, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Recently, you caught some pretty nice bass out there yourself, right?
Out of the reservoir?
I think you posted something on the NVKBA website recently, right?
I've been fishing the reservoir for 10 years, and as much as a couple times a week. So I've spent a lot of time on that water.
What's the biggest one you've caught out there?
Probably the one that got away. I had one at nighttime that I got up to the boat that I could put my hand and a whole fist in his mouth, but I've caught
really?
plenty of 21s.
Wow. Yeah, easy. Yeah, great anyway.
If I live close to Occoquan Reservoir and I like to fish for largemouth bass, I would never go anywhere else.
Yeah. It's funny because Dave beat me last year in the Fallborough. Oh, thanks, Dave. Appreciate it, buddy. I'm kidding with him. So some of the other questions, I think you pretty much covered most of these from Dave. Bed fishing, hook removal, cutting the hook or leaving it in half. You did cover them?
Yeah.
You said user discretion or angler discretion. Right?
You cut the line or try to pull it out if you think you can do it.
So should we be concerned about the Alabama stream?
Yes, we should be concerned about Alabama bass.
Okay, why?
They screw up a lot of fisheries by genetic introgression. They breed, not so much largemouth, although we don't know for sure, but with smallmouth for damn sure. So if you like smallmouth bass fishing, then you should be concerned about Alabama bass because they will interbreed with smallmouth and the resulting offspring will be insufficient mutts and not grow big.
That sucks. So they are complete opposite of the Florida stream.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Alabama bass. If you like catching big bass, Alabama is the farthest thing on the planet that you want to see.
This is for Will out in the others, right? I don't want to hear anything more about roll tide. I don't want to hear anything about Alabama. No, I'm kidding. So with that being said, then if we move on, he said, Steve, I'm talking from Dave. Okay, we covered all that. So, all right, hey Dave, anything else you want to add?
No, I just want to thank you very much for doing this, Jim, and Mr. Odenkirk. I really appreciate you being on. This has been wonderful.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely love having you here. Seriously, a wealth of knowledge. Thank you. So this question from Chris Johnston, is he on? Great last name, Chris. Maybe he's not on? Okay, so Chris asked, how is the muskie population doing? Switch it over a little bit.
Well, generally, if somebody asks me how the muskie population is doing, I would like to know what water body they're talking about. But since 3 questions later, he references the Rappahannock, I'm going to assume he's talking about the Rappahannock. And to that, I would say it's doing terribly. I've worked that river for 30 years, and I've never seen a muskie. We've never stocked the Rappahannock, and we don't intend to. So,
honestly, sorry, we're talking about this area as a whole.
okay, well, so, and again, I got to plead a little bit of ignorance here. The Potomac is technically Maryland's river. We manage our tributaries like Occoquan, Aquia, etc. I don't know that much about the fisheries of the main stem Potomac because it's Maryland's river, and they don't co-manage it with us. Although we have reciprocity on licenses in the title section. So I don't know about muskie in the Potomac.
You know what, I'm going to earmark that for later so that way we can talk about it.
But we have some of the best muskie fisheries on the East Coast in Virginia. But I'm talking about the New River, the James River, and even the Shenandoah. Smallmouth down around Blacksburg, yeah, Radford, Blacksburg, down towards West Virginia. It's unbelievable. So I'd encourage people that want to like to fish for that to go southwest. But we also, you don't have to go that far. Shenandoah River, the Newport boat landing, which is only an hour and change, 20 minutes from here. Great muskie fishery. Not at the same level as the New River, but really good muskie fishery. And Burke Lake still has a few muskie, but
that's just right in the road.
Yeah, it's right down the road. We still stock it, but it's not what it used to be.
And not to get too far away from, we're talking, I understand the theme is bass, and we can come back to some of the other questions, but if we're talking about muskie,
there's a couple of hardcore anglers that are still
trying to find that PB, that muskie PB.
Yeah.
MPB.
It's within the realm.
It gets pretty deep in there.
I think max depth's around, it's 30-ish. It's 30, give or take a few feet. It's filled in a lot over the years.
I mean, it's certainly, I mean, it's still pretty damn deep. I mean, and I'm always pretty excited when I'm looking on the fish finder, looking on the scope, trying to figure out like, ooh, there's a good one. I mean, obviously you can't tell it's a bass.
There's some big walleye in there too. We stocked walleye in a lot.
He was saying that the other day.
It's just 8-10 pounds. County, and he drives into Burke in rush hour traffic on weekdays to fish Burke Lake from Fauquier County. I was like, he's figured it out, he's patterned it, and there are a lot of big bass in Burke. I don't know that there's a lot of 8+ pit fish, but there's a lot of 3 to 6s, kind of like the Occoquan used to be before the Occoquan got somebody injected it with steroids, and now the Occoquan is just silly. But Burke is sort of like Occoquan used to be. There's loads of football shaped 3 to 5s and some 6s. But you don't see 7s and 8s in Burke. You just don't. And some of that's maybe genetics.
I guess that's a good segue then into the F1 stream. So can you talk?
Original cross between a pure northern largemouth bass and a pure Florida largemouth bass. Those are bred in a hatchery, typically, from our standpoint, usually a private hatchery, because we're buying these fish from the private sector rather than rearing them ourselves. And so once the hatchery produces these pure original back cross between the parents, the pure parents, that's the F1. That F1 contains inherent traits that make it very desirable, like fast growth and achieving large size, and ability to withstand it's terrible. It's a waste. But so for a hybrid, it's like a hybrid vigor thing. You're creating the best of both worlds. But most people think, and I don't know that this is, the science is not shut. I don't think it's ever shut on anything. But most people think that the benefits of the F1s is just that first generation, because essentially what we have now in Virginia is all FXs, because we've stopped. Nothing's pure northern anymore in where we live, and nothing's pure Florida. And a lot of lakes were stocked with Florida bass back before we realized it really wasn't the best thing to do. And other people have stocked Florida bass around, and so essentially, and again, it might be 30% Florida alleles here. It might be 60% Florida alleles here. And usually when you see the higher percentage of Florida alleles, you have enhanced trophy potential. And I say 8+ pound fish.
Oh, that's a big fish.
But with the trophy potential, sometimes there's baggage. Sometimes there's a chance of more stockpiling and slow growing younger fish. Germantown Lake in Fauquier is a good example of that. Very high percentage of Florida alleles, one of the few lakes we see 10, 11 pound plus bass, but for just insane numbers of 8 to 14 inch fish that aren't growing very well. Is that because medial stocking of largemouth bass, we only use F1s. And we'll typically, and we can track those fish. We used to track the fish with a tag, a little piece of metal in them called a micro tag, or we dye them with oxytetracycline, which leave a stain on their otolith, which we pull out of their heads. It's kind of a weird thing, but now technology's improved so that when we stock F1s and we'll give it system, if we catch that fish a couple years later, all we do is take a fin clip of that fish and we send it to a genetics lab, and they can determine if it's really an F1 or if it's an FX, or if it's a fish that was there maybe before we ever stocked anything. So that a small number of F1s. So we're not trying to like boost the numbers of fish overall in the lake. Mother Nature does a great job of that. We get huge spawns at all these lakes. But by inserting a few numbers of F1s, 7, 8, 9 years down the road, can we see a higher number of 8, 9, 10, even 11-pound fish?
Growth potential is the overall
Well, increasing the potential of a real trophy. That's what we want to do down the road. And if it works, so then what we'll do is we'll just budget for that, and we'll go on a rotational basis to all these lakes and just stock, you know, if we were normally stocking remedial, whatever, you know, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you know, conventional wisdom 15, 20, 30 years ago on remedial black bass stocking was it's a waste of time and money. And so that's why we fought it early on with the Chickahominy. You know, when CBAB came to us and that I described what happened in the Rappahannock in the 1998 through 2003 time period, we didn't want to stock remedial because we didn't want to waste our money. And we looked at the literature. The literature said, don't do it. But then CBAB handed us $50,000, and they said, "Well, here's your money. You know, you can stock these fish or not. We can't turn down $50,000."
Hell no, you're never gonna get it.
So we marked the fish back then. We used the micro tags in the head, and we put them out there, and lo and behold, it made a difference. So we learned something. It was, and we published that work, and it was actually very major work, and changed sort of the philosophy of black bass management, especially in tidal systems. So that's what we're doing with F1s now. Maybe the same thing can happen.
It's just kind of like a model for the way ahead.
Could be. It's not going to work everywhere.
Like maybe not, I understand there's a lot of variables, but still, it's a good way.
You've got to have the productivity, and this fish have to survive. If you don't have the habitat, you're stocking them, it's a waste of time.
Wow. That is, I think we're almost